Hi there, I'm going to show you how you can stitch princess seams such as these ones here on this bodice. So they're the seams which run over the bust on both sides. There's different ways in which you can stitch these princess seams, and I'm going to show you 3 methods that you could use for this. If you're on one of my courses, you'll be creating a front bodice that will look something like this when it's finished. You'll have been given a pattern for the easing sample which looks like this, so you'll need to cut this from the paper first and then cut it out of fabric. Your pattern pieces will look like this, and the bodice side front is going to match to the bodice front, matching at the notches here and here. You'll notice on this pattern piece that it says ease, and that's where we're going to be trying to get rid of some of the fullness in this piece to match into this one. So this piece is actually ever so slightly larger, and that's so that you can create the shaping in the seam which goes over the bust. So the next thing is to cut these 2 pieces from fabric. So you'll need to cut the bodice front on the fold of the fabric just once, and you'll need to cut 2 of the bodice side front. It's best if you start by folding your fabric in half. I'm going to fold it so that the selvage edges come together. I'm folding this right side out. Quite often I fold right side in, but for the purpose of this it doesn't matter. You'll place your bodice front piece on the fold of the fabric, and I've got a pattern on my fabric, so I'm making sure my pattern is direction is the right way up. So that piece, I'm going to just try and be economical with it, fitting that one there and fitting this one here. And I can pin those 2 pieces in place and then cut them out. You should have then 3 pieces cut, so my piece for the bodice front and 2 pieces for the side fronts, and I've also put small snips where the notches are so that I can match those correctly. The first technique I'm going to show you to ease in the princess seams is a method that you can use on sleeves as well. So what I will do is to take one side bodice piece, and I'm going to stitch around this curved edge here, so the notched edge. I'm going to put in 2 lines of long machine stitch within the seam allowance. Now my seam allowance on this pattern is 1.5 centimeters, so I'm going to put my first line of stitching at 1 centimeter and then my second line of stitching at 1.3 centimeters or thereabouts. So long as both lines are less than 1.5 centimeters from the edge, when I sew my seam afterwards, both of those lines of long machine stitch will be hidden. I'm going to start my stitching just above where the notch is on the notched edge, and I'm going to line up the raw edge of the fabric with the 10 line on my needle plate. So that will mean I'm stitching 1 centimeter from the edge of the fabric. I'm going to set my machine to do a long machine stitch, so I'm going to turn this dial up to 4. That might be the highest on yours, or you might have a setting for a longer machine stitch. And then I'm going to just run my long machine stitch around the edge of this, around the notched edge. So I'm not back tacking at all because I want to be able to pull on those threads afterwards. So when I get to my other notch here, I'm going to just stitch slightly beyond it, take the needle out and then stop there. And now I'm going to run a second line of long machine stitch at 1.2, 1.3 centimeters. So starting in the same place as before, just above that notch. And this time I'm stitching sort of between the 10 and the 15 line. So still again within the seam allowance, but just slightly to the left of the first line that I stitched. So as I go, I'm keeping an eye on the 15 line here and the edge of the fabric and making sure that I don't come over that 15 line. and then stopping in the same place. I've put my long machine stitch then around this notched edge here, and I'm going to just pull this up ever so slightly. So I'm going to try and do that from the wrong side, because the bobbin threads usually pull more easily than the top threads. So separate the top and the bottom threads, and I'm going to just pull on those bottom threads just a little bit. So this isn't like gathering. You don't want the final seam to appear gathered, you just want to ease that in slightly. So what you'll see is below the stitch line, I'll show you that way up, below the stitch line you don't have any gathering, but above the stitch line the edge here just starts to become a little bit fluted. So that's the kind of finish that you're after. So I'll pull this up just slightly from the other end, pulling on the bobbin threads and just easing that in along there, so just reducing the fullness around that edge ever so slightly. And you'll see it starts to create a kind of 3D shape, and it starts to curl that edge up. So this will be now matched to this edge, so this is going to fit into this side here on the bodice front. So I'm going to place these right sides together and match the notch at the bottom. So matching the notches at the bottom and putting in a pin. And I'm pinning on the side where the ease stitching is, and then I'm going to pin all the way down to the bottom of that seam. And I'm going to then match the notches at the top. So matching that notch there, matching that one at the top. And then what I need to do next is to get this edge here to fit to the other edge. As you'll see that there's a little bit of difference between those sizes, because perhaps I've just pulled that up a little bit too much. So I'm going to just flatten out the easing stitches slightly, and then when I match these two together, what I find works best is if you kind of go in between the two pins that you've already got. So aim for the centre and just roughly guess that you've got about the same amount of easing either side. So you don't want to have all the pulling of the threads in one section. So kind of like when you gather up the edge of the fabric, it needs to be evenly distributed. And then I'm going to aim for the centre and put a pin in the centre position there, and then match those two edges together here, and again pin in the centre between the two pins. And then I just kind of use this as my technique. So once I've put in one pin, I then pin in between the two and then work my way back round, matching those raw edges together. So here, matching those raw edges together and putting in a pin. And I'm just going to put another pin in here. So I find the more pins you put in, the more chance you're going to have of matching this and getting a nice evenly distributed easing. And also at the end you want to make sure that your seam line sits flat without any puckering. So I've got quite a few pins in there, but I think that should work. So I'm going to take this back to the machine and then just stitch this seam, and my stitching will be 1.5 centimeters from the edge, so it should sit just to this side here of the e-stitching. So when I turn it to the right side, the e-stitching won't be seen. I've lined up the edge of my fabric with the 15 line so that my seam will be 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the fabric, and it should be slightly further over than the e-stitching. Make sure that you've changed your stitch length to 2.5 or your regular length stitch before you begin this. So back tack to begin, and then stitch around the seam, taking care to make sure that you're not puckering the fabric as you go along. And then back tack again at the end. I finished my stitching on the machine, and you can see the 3 lines of stitching there. So I've got my 2 lines of ease stitching, and then that's my seam. So the ease stitching is all within the seam allowance. I can take out the pins, and I can now cut any of the threads from the ease stitching or any of the threads from the seam. And then the check really, I'll just cut those threads there. The check is to make sure that there's no puckering visible from the right side of the seam. So you want this to sit completely flat all the way round. Which it does. So this seam can then be pressed to one side. You can press it over a tailor's ham if you have one, or just press it over the edge of the ironing board and press the seam flat. Now on the inside, just clip around the seam here a little bit, because it will help that to sit flat once it's pressed. And then I shall open this out, and you can press the seam to one side, or you can press it flat and open. So I'm going to press this open all the way along. Okay, so that's one side complete. Then for the second side, I'm going to show you method number 2. For method number 2, I'm going to use a technique which is often found on a commercial pattern, where you use stay stitching and clipping. So instead of making this side smaller to fit into this edge, I'm going to try and make this edge slightly longer so that this piece will fit. So I start by stay stitching along this edge between the notches, or you can do your stitching slightly further than the notches, and stitching around this notched edge. And I do my stay stitching 1.3 centimeters from the raw edge, so it's within the seam allowance, and I use a regular length stitch and put the back tacking at the beginning and at the end of the seam. So I'll start by just putting my line of stay stitching in this edge, and the stay stitching will stay in the garment, but it will allow you to clip up to the stay stitching so that that edge can spread and become ever so slightly wider, so that the longer edge can fit to it. I've set my machine to do a regular length stitch of 2.5, and I've got my fabric positioned between the 10 and the 15 line on the needle plate. So I'll start by back tacking, so taking a few stitches forward and back, and then I'm just going to stitch about 1.2 to 1.3 centimeters from the edge all the way along that notched edge of the bodice front. And then when you get to the end, just back tack there to finish off. I've put my stay stitching in this bodice front section along the notched edge, and I'm just cutting those thread ends, and what I want to do next is to clip up to that stay stitching, and I'm putting quite a few clips in, and I'm going as close up to that stitching as I can, but don't go through the stitching. So I've clipped between the notches, and I've also put an extra clip just either side of where the notches are. And then I'm going to take my bodice front here, and before I match them together, I'm just going to put some more little snips into here so I can see clearly where the notches are in this piece. And I've also made sure that on the bodice front sections my actual notches are cut as little triangles rather than snips. Otherwise it gets confusing as to which is the notch that you're matching and which is the snip that you've just cut into your fabric. So matching those two together, and I'm going to turn them over so that I put my pins into the edge that's clipped, so that I can see that I'm not making any errors with pleating this side or folding any of those little flaps out of the way. So I shall match where the notches are and put in some pins, pinning down to the bottom edge of the fabric. And then I shall match where the notch is at the top, so matching that notch there. And matching up there. And then, as I did with method 1, I want to kind of find where the middle point is there and then put my pin in the middle of that piece. So I think that's about there. And then once I've pinned that point in position, I'm then going to pin in between the pins. As you do this, the clips will fan out, making this bit wider so that it will match to that longer edge. And then I shall pin in between the pins, pin in between the pins again, matching those raw edges, and then along this other side here doing the same thing. So in between the pins, matching the midpoint, and then putting some more pins in between, matching here, and then another one in here. And then I shall go to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch on the clipped side, and I'm stitching 1.5 centimetres, so the regular seam allowance all the way along that edge. I've lined the edge of my fabric up with the 15 line on the needle plate, so I'll be stitching 1.5 centimetres or 15 millimetres from the edge of the fabric. So I'll back tack to begin, and then sew the seam all the way around. So you'll see that as I'm stitching, my stitch line comes to the left of the stay stitching. So once I finish, the stay stitching won't be seen in the seam. And then when I get to the end here, I'm just going to back tack again to finish off and secure my stitches. I've finished my seam, and you'll see that the seam line is just slightly beyond where the stay stitching is, and then you can check that you haven't puckered on the other side of the fabric, or from the right side you can make sure that that seam does sit flat all the way along. And actually I found that my method 2 has worked better than method 1, and actually that sits flatter around the seam line than my first than my first method. So again, what I want to do is to press this flat, and you can put some clips into the other side of the seam allowance to help that to sit flat. So I'll just press this open. You can press this open on the ironing board like so, or you could use tailor's ham so that you can press over the curved shape. I tend to just lift that up a little bit and press just on the ironing board. So you can see from the right side that sits nice and flat. For technique number 3, I've cut some new pieces. So I've got my bodice side front, and I've just cut half of the bodice front section. So this is just to demonstrate the third technique. And for this method, I'm going to turn the pieces to the wrong side. And I've cut my notches into the edges here as before, cutting those as triangles. What I'm going to actually do is remove some of the seam allowance. So my seam allowance on these pieces is 1.5 centimetres, and this technique I'm going to take off 1 centimetre of the seam allowance, leaving me just with 0.5 centimetre to stitch the seam. And because the two raw edges will then you won't have such a deep seam allowance, this technique can actually make it easier to stitch two pieces together where one is slightly larger than the other. So I'll try this technique, and then you can use this on your sample at home if you want to. So I'm just going to measure in 1 centimetre and just put a mark along this edge here. And then where I've got the notch, I'm just going to draw that line a little bit further in, because I'll probably end up cutting off the notch once I cut off the seam allowance. So just measuring 1 centimetre all around that edge. Again, drawing a line in slightly where the notch is so that I don't lose that marker. And then on the second edge as well, I'm going to measure in 1 centimetre on the bodice front section. And again at the notch, just drawing a line in for that notch. So I'm marking onto the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm using an air erasable pen, but this part of the edge, even if you have got markings on it, it will all be part of the seam allowance, so it won't be seen once the garment is finished. So now I've done that, I'm going to just cut away the section that I've marked. I'm going to swap to some bigger scissors. So I'll just cut away 1 centimetre from that edge. I'm just going to line that back up because I forgot to put where that notch was. So I'm going to just draw my notch line in. Make sure your line where you're drawing your notch comes beyond the centimetre that you're cutting away. And then cut away the centimetre from the bodice side front. Just make sure you're being accurate here, because that is important that you cut away 1 centimetre and then stitch a 0.5 centimetre seam. I'm going to match these two sides, right sides together, and I'm going to pin from the bodice side front side, so matching those notches there at the top, putting in a pin, and then matching that right to the top edge there and pinning the top edges together, and then matching my notch at the bottom so I can see where I've got the marker there on both edges of the fabric, matching those, and then matching that to the bottom edge of the piece. And I'm going to just lay that on there. So this is the longest side, and I'm going to stitch with the longer side facing me. So I want to just see how that's fitting into that space there. And then I'm going to aim for the centre point between those two pins, between the two notches, which is about here. So I want to just make sure I've got about the same amount of ease either side, and then pin there, and then I'll pin again, finding the midpoint between those two pins and pinning in the middle there. And then I'll keep doing that until I have pinned in all the fullness on that piece. So pinning between the pins again. So that's sitting nice and flat around that section. And pinning between the pins here, matching those raw edges. And then between these two pins here, making sure that if there's any fullness there, that you're sort of spreading it between the two sections. And then pinning again between the pins, and then I'll just put in a couple more pins, so one there and then one in this section, just to hold those edges together. And that should be enough pins so that I can make sure that my seam is going to stitch and not give me any puckering either side. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to use a 1/2 centimetre seam. On my needle plate, I don't have a marker for 1/2 centimetre, so what I've done is I'll just measure from the needle across 1/2 centimetre, and then I've used masking tape just to give me a line, a guideline to stitch my seam. So I can use that masking tape and I can keep the edge of my fabric against the tape as I sew. I've stitched my seam 1/2 centimetre from the edge, so I can take the pins out and just check from the other side that that isn't puckered at all along that edge. I can cut the threads there, and then if I open that out flat and check from the right side and just make sure that there is no puckering, you'll see that actually that has been really successful, and I can now press the seam flat or press to one side. That's method 3 finished, and you can choose any of these 3 methods to ease two pieces of fabric together.